Sally grew up in Iota, Tennessee, and she attended high school right here in this very building. She went on to graduate from TWC, now U, and then she received her master's from the University of Tennessee. She stayed at home for about 10 years, I'm sure, as a stay-at-home mother, and then after that, she went to teaching at Inglewood School, and she taught 7th and 8th grade students for 26 years. And I was telling Joe Guy this morning, I'm going to embarrass some people here, but when I was thinking about this morning when I woke up, I think of Joe and Bill Akins as our two premier male historians. I think of Sally Ealy and Patsy Duckworth as our two female historians. And we're so blessed to have all this vast knowledge in our community here. We're really delighted to have them. But Sally absolutely loves Keith Church. She loves their community. She loves McMinn County. She loves her church. And I think one of the biggest blessings the good Lord has given us in Athens is Sally Ealy, because she has such a vast knowledge of history, and she has been so willing to share that, not only with the museum through all of our years. I started here in '87, and Sally was one of the first people I think I got to know. She had her students doing history projects, and we're just so blessed to have her here in the community. And I wanted to ask Joe Guy if he wouldn't mind coming up. Joe wanted to share just a couple of things, and then Sally will be finished with embarrassing you, and we'll turn it over to you.
I don't think I need the microphone. Ann was telling me, and she failed to include herself in female historians locally too. But she was telling me that Miss Ealy had said, "I don't want anybody bragging on me." Well, she didn't tell me that. So. Very quickly, because I know you didn't come to hear me, you came to hear her. We all did. I've been blessed to get to do a few things and to be where I am in this position, but this is one of the people that put me here. I had Miss Ealy. I was blessed to have her 2 years in a row. We had split grades back then, and so when I was in the 7th grade, I got exposed to her, and then I got to have her again in the 8th grade. And I always liked history as a child, but when she got through with me, I loved history. And we literally, John Gentry and I have talked many times, we didn't have a history teacher. We had a historian that taught us for those 2 years. And it was just such a phenomenal experience to be in the 7th and 8th grade, about to go to high school, and having that interest that a lot of people thought was just kind of nerdy, and nobody just, social studies and history was just something that you did, unless you were people like me and John and some other folks. And we literally, we kept everything that she ever gave us. I can remember her, here's John right now. He may want to say something too. I kept every note, every clipping, everything. Those years of grammar school stand out in my mind because of Miss Sally Ealy. And she really encouraged us to dig into local history. She showed us what local history really was, and the wealth of it in any community, much less ours. And she had already done so much work that I know I have gone back and drawn on things that she has written about or researched or set in front of us and exposed us to in ways that nobody else ever really did. And I've told her before, she's my favorite teacher all the way through school. And I've got another, I have to be careful, there's a couple other who are close seconds. But Miss Ealy was hard to beat just because of the history. And I will forever be in her debt. I think I asked you to put something in that book to make sure that it says in that book that I'm her former student. That's how I wanted to be, and I'm sure John feels the same way. We always want to be known as Miss Ealy's former students because of how she touched our lives, and neither one of us would probably be where we are today, and certainly not to have the historical inclination that we have. And so without further ado, I'll introduce Miss Sally Ealy, unless you want to say something. You good? Have I covered it all? All right, Miss Sally.
Thank you so much, Joe. Joe and I have come full circle. I used to grade his papers. Now, when I write history, who do you think I ask to read it and comment on it? And it's Joe, so we've made the full circle. The book that is available with the quilt, it is available because John Gentry, I don't see him. Where is John? John Gentry and Mark Cochran met with me. I couldn't use the mic. They met with me the 1st of February and said, do you still have your notes that you used to teach from with that quilt? And I thought, do you all really know me? Of course I've got my notes. And they said, would you care to update your notes? Because we have the idea of having a booklet to give to McMinn County teachers, and I'm not sure what grade level they're going to do this, so that local history could be taught this fall in the schools, because at the present time, local history is not being taught. So during the bicentennial, because they requested that, we will have those books in the school system. And I would never have published it if they had not requested it, and I appreciate that. I want to thank each one of you for coming today. We had no idea if 10 people would show up or, who would show up. So I thank each one of you for giving your time to come. This is going to be informal. Those of you that have other obligations, or those of you that are here on your lunch hour, if you need to go, don't worry about it. That's the way that this is set up, to be very informal, these history for lunch things. Now, I will do the Keith family history first, and then I'll move into the history of Keith Church. But we have our two ministers here from Keith Church. We have Reverend David Graybill right over here, and Reverend Andrew Lay there. Do either one of you want to say anything before I start?
What a treasure Sally is, so it's a joy to be here.
That's not what I meant. I thought you'd say, if you don't have a church home, we welcome you with the
Well said, well said.
That's what I expected. But anyway, I do appreciate each one of you for coming. And how I wish I could start this today by telling you that mine and your ancestors moved into East Tennessee and into McMinn County for religious reasons, but they did not. I can't tell you that. Most of them came for land, this wonderful land that we have. Tennessee was not one of the 13 original colonies. We were the 16th state into the Union. So when you only had 13 original states, we were North Carolina's western land, and most of the people that came in here came across the mountains and came into this region. And they came for different reasons. They came because they didn't like the government of North Carolina, very simply. Or North Carolina was getting very crowded. My goodness, your neighbor might be a mile away, so it's time to move on. They came for other reasons. They came for this land because it's wonderful. And then a fourth group, and I hope this is none of your relatives or mine, they came here because they were in trouble with the law. And the law said you can go to jail or you can go to the Tennessee country. So across the mountains they came. So when we get to talking about church history, you talk about a time when churches were needed. This was the frontier, and churches were needed on the frontier. So if you'll just keep that in mind, the place we are right now, you had other denominations besides the Methodist, but all were needed on the frontier. Now we're going to start with the first Keith. Do we have any DAR members here? Good. Alexander Keith was from the state of Virginia. And he is the one that the Daughters of the American Revolution group here in town is named for. And the family started in Virginia. Now, he will move down here to Tennessee to Greene County. And when his son, Charles Fleming Keith, gets 18 years of age, he will go back to Virginia and live with his relatives, the Marshalls. Think of that name in Virginia history. Alexander Keith, the family had a whole bunch of kids. The oldest son was John Marshall, who will serve on the U.S. Supreme Court for over 30 years. That's his cousin. This is people that they came from. So when Alexander Keith goes back to Virginia, he reads law with his cousin, Charles Keith, who is a younger brother of John. Wait a minute, I'm mixing up my people. He reads with his cousin, Marshall. And when he has read enough law, he passes the bar, and the family moves down to Jefferson County, Cobb County, in that area. Now, he's a lawyer at this point. He is elected to the Tennessee General Assembly. He eventually will be a Tennessee State Senator. And this is where we're interested in him. There will be treaties made with the Cherokee Indians. One's made in 1817, of which they'll sell off land. And the one we're interested in is the one made in 1819 that creates McMinn County. But Judge Keith, he will be appointed judge. And by the way, you probably walk by his picture upstairs in the hallway. So when you leave here, you might check out Judge Charles Fleming Keith. He's right in the hallway, and a room upstairs is dedicated to the Keith family. Miss Catherine Keith, very interested when the museum was formed to have her family remembered. But Judge Keith will be appointed the judge of the judicial district here. He will move down here. Now we're going to talk about 2 Keith plantations. So if you'll just help me, we'll keep them straight. Judge Keith's plantation is where the Mayfield farm is today. I heard Scotty Mayfield several weeks ago speaking to Kiwanis saying they have about 600 acres out there now. Judge Keith had 1,400 acres. So take the Mayfield farm as it is today and double that more in size, and you will know what size of plantation he had. Of course, he brought slaves in to work the plantation. So that's part of our history. Now, Judge Keith is never a Methodist. He was an Episcopalian, and there were no Episcopal churches here. And when he opened court, he always opened with prayer, and when he charged a jury, to ask for the Lord's guidance in doing the right thing. Very religious, just didn't happen to be a Methodist. Now, he had a friend, Dr. Augustine Fore, and Dr. Fore moved his family down here, and he bought several tracts of land. The one we're interested in is the one where the Keith Mansion is located today. Now, do all of you know the area that we call Keith Mansion? It's on Keith Lane, that's easy to find. It is right beside of Walgreens there. So if you don't know the Keith plantation home, you need to drive by and see the Keith Mansion. But that part of town belonged to Dr. Fore, and he owned a tremendous amount of land. And of course, he brought his slaves here. His wife was Nancy Fore. Now, I am pronouncing it Fore, F-O-R-E. When we had some visitors at Keith Church, we asked them how they pronounced it, Fore or Forey, and they said both. So you're all right if you pronounce it either way, according to the Keith family, but we will call it the Fore plantation at that time. Dr. Augustine Fore and his wife, Nancy, only had one child. Now, most people on the frontier had a whole big bunch of kids, but they had one child. Her name was Sarah Ann Penelope Fore. And guess who she married? Judge Keith's son. So then we get Judge Keith on one end of town, and we get Sarah Ann Penelope Ford and her husband on the other end of town. The Ford home was a beautiful home there. Eventually it will burn, and Sarah Ann and her husband will build the Keith Mansion that we know it today. Now, when you came in, you were given a handout. If you look at that, this is one of my favorite pictures from the Keith history book. And by the way, we haven't mentioned everything on this table is from Keith Church, and it's free. So any information up there that you want, please feel free to take it. Now I want you to find Sarah Ann Penelope Ford. She is seated right in the center of her large family. She may have been an only child, but she had a big family. Now have you found Sarah Ann Penelope Ford right in the center? I want you to read what we wrote in the book about her, and we have highlighted it for you. Mrs. Alexander Hume Keith, Sarah Ann Penelope Ford, a devoted member of this congregation, loved her church and served it. Through her training and example, she developed in her family a sense of appreciation for the church and a deep responsibility toward it. She is pictured here in the center of her family. Now, standing the left front, right here, and you find this gentleman, Alexander Marshall Keith, her son, and seated beside of him is Alice McGuire Keith, holding their infant daughter, Catherine Douglas Keith. Miss Catherine as a baby, and Miss Catherine as she looked in 1978. Now, being the good historians that we were, we did not put a date on this picture in the history book. And you can imagine why. Had we put a date on that picture, everyone would have known how old Miss Catherine was. And so we very conveniently left off the date. We had an idea about when the date was, but we were not about to approach that. Now I want you to find her brother. He has the bow tie on, and he's seated directly in front of his grandmother. This is Marshall Keith, Miss Catherine's brother. These are the people who have meant the most to Keith Church. We have stained glass windows in the church. Each one of them is dedicated to one of these that we've just looked at. The chancel window in front of the church is dedicated to Marshall Keith, who's down here at the bottom. A window at the back of the church, we have 3 down each side of the sanctuary. In the very back is one dedicated to Sarah Ann Penelope Ford Keith. And on the opposite side is one dedicated to Miss Catherine Keith, and that didn't happen while she was alive. She never would have stood for that. When she died, a circle at Keith named for her went to the board and said, we really want that window dedicated to Miss Catherine. And so they did. And it's in the back of the church. Now, 2 windows up front, one is dedicated to her mother, Alice McGuire Keith, and one to her father that you saw there. These are the people from the Keith family who held Keith Church together. And it is from the Ford family that we get the Methodism. Now, if you'll turn over on the back, you will see a picture of the Keith Mansion as it looked when Sarah Ann Penelope and her husband built it after the original home there on the farm had burned that belonged to her mother. They built this, and if you look, it was built in 1858. It was supposed to have 4 large columns on the front, but according to Miss Catherine, the Yankees burned them during the Civil War, so they never got installed on the church, on the front of the home. They had the porch that went up halfway. Now notice the spindles on that. Those beautiful spindles. And then if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, you will see the altar rail at Keith Church. And you can guess where the spindles came from. When Marshall Keith and his wife Gertrude renovated the Keith Mansion in 1938, they saved those spindles from atop the porch. And when our church burned and we had to rebuild on the site that we are today, Ms. Marshall Keith came forward and said she would like to give the church enough of those hand-turned spindles to make our altar rail. So you need to really pay attention when you're inside Keith Church to those. About a year ago, refurbishing was done of the sanctuary. We may have some people here that were on that committee. But the first Sunday back in the sanctuary, Dave was giving children's sermon. And he said to the children, we have new benches, we got new chairs, we got new. But we've got something in here that's 160 years old. And it was those hand-turned spindles. And then he gave the nicest lesson. He said, when the Lord made us, he made us all the same. We all look the same. We've all got a head. We've all got shoulders. We've all got arms. We've all got legs. We look alike. But the Lord, in his wisdom, made each one of us special in his own way. We're a little different. We have different talents. We have different interests. So think of those spindles when that woodworker was making them. From the back of the church, you look at it and they all look alike. But if you're up close, you're going to see a tiny bit of difference in each one of those spindles. And it's such a lesson to us about how that woodworker made those just a tiny bit different, just like the Lord made us special in our own way. So anyway, any questions about these? You have it as one handout. Any questions there? Okay, let's move into Keith Church's history. You have a handout, only yours is in color, of a brief history of Keith Church. And I'm going to use it kind of like an outline in going through the history of Keith Church. We will move through starting when McMinn County was formed. I told you that we had a treaty made with the Indians in 1817 where certain tracts of land were sold off. Well, somebody had to draw the lines, and Judge Keith was the one who used Thomas Jefferson's plans. He simply took a map of McMinn County and shaped kind of like an arrowhead. He drew the straight lines down, straight lines across. The land was sold off in townships, 6 miles square. It was sold off in sections. If you bought a whole section, you had 640 acres. If you bought a quarter section, you had 160 acres. So any of you want to read your deeds, it probably will talk about section lines, townships, quarter sections, and you'll know what we're talking about. 2 years later, when Calhoun's treaty was made, the same plan was made to sell off the land. So anyway, it was Judge Keith who drew those lines and told us how to sell the land. That's when he came in here and bought his 1,400 acres out where the Mayfield farm is. Now, Keith Church was founded in 1824. It is the oldest Methodist church in town. The first court was held in Calhoun. Calhoun used to have the cutest little sign as you drive in. It always put a smile on my face. They said McMinn's oldest and finest. I don't know why in the world they don't have that sign up today, because I'd smile every time I drove in there. But we started down at Calhoun because John C. Calhoun made the treaty with the Cherokee Indians to buy this huge tract of land in 1819. He bought enough land, we bought enough land from the Indians to where we could create 2 counties. We created McMinn County and Monroe County. The boundary lines were the Hiwassee River on the south and the Little Tennessee River on the north. So if you're up in Monroe County, they also are celebrating a bicentennial up there. So anyway, here we go into our history. Our church was founded in 1824. The town of Athens had been laid out as a town 1 year before that, and they had moved the county seat from the little log church down at Calhoun up to Athens to make the county seat more in the center of the county. And the church was founded just 1 year after that. We are not the oldest church in town. That's the Presbyterians. The Baptist and the Methodist came in the same year, 1824. And we built the first church in 1825. Now, in your imagination, you've got to go downtown with me to the courthouse. Are you down there? Come 1 block forward. Do you know where Athens Cleaners is located? Across the street, there's a credit union there, a brick credit union. When you look across the street, you see the parking lot of Athens Federal or Capstar. Our church sat where that credit union sits today. We were just 1 block from the courthouse. Keith Church has had 4 buildings in its history. That's easy to remember. We got 4 columns on the front of the church, if you ever forget. We had 3 of them downtown. We started with the log church, and it was Nancy Ford who took her slaves from the plantation downtown and built that first log church that we had. And it will serve for a number of years before we can build a brick church downtown. Now, our early ministers were the circuit riding ministers. These were ministers who, on horseback, they packed their Bible, a hymnal, whatever they had, and they rode from one preaching place to the next. The most famous of the circuit riding preachers was William G. Parson Brownlow, who was assigned to our church in 1829. Now, I don't know how much you know about Parson Brownlow. Keith Church has had over 100 ministers in their history. He's the worst one. So ministers at Keith don't have to ever worry about being the worst. We've already had that. Parson Brownlow came into our church. Remember, this is Frontier. He always carried a gun. If you can imagine listening to a sermon in a log church with a gun belt draped over the pulpit, knowing the preacher had a gun, and preaching a hellfire and brimstone sermon, and then getting on his horse and riding off to another preaching place. You know, this was it. Parson Brownlow hated some different things. He hated the Baptist. Sorry for you Baptists in the room. He hated the Presbyterians. He hated the devil. He hated them all equally. Now, when he preached, he not only preached the Bible, he preached on the politics of the day. So in his 1 year in our church in Athens, he made so many enemies that they named a dog for him. And then they apologized to the dog for naming him such an awful name. Parson Brownlow was a circuit riding preacher for 10 years in the Methodist church. Fortunately, only 1 year here in Athens, but he preached other places for 9 years. Then he decided he'd rather be a newspaper editor. So he's from Knoxville. He moved up there. He was the editor of the Knoxville Whig. His editorials were like he had dipped his pen in poison. He continued what he had started here in Athens. How many of you remember the Knoxville Journal newspaper? Raise your hand if you can remember that. That's Parson Brownlow's newspaper. The Knoxville Whig became the Knoxville Journal. He was the newspaper editor there when the church, the issue of slavery raised its head in the church. And all 3 big denominations on the frontier, the Methodist, the Baptist, and the Presbyterians, will all split over the issue of slavery. So in 1844, downtown in our little log church, we became Methodist Episcopal Church South. Definitely get the South in there. If you drive through Riceville today, look up where the little Methodist church, it's closed now, but where it was located right there on the highway. And up above the window, it will say ME Church South. It's the only place I know around here that says that. But anyway, we were a Southern Methodist church. Now, I want to talk about the camp meetings they had on the frontier before we move further in the history. Camp meetings, this was an agricultural region, and the farmers would plant their crop, they worked their crop, and then they had a period where they would say, we laid it by. And I'm sure some of you have heard that term. We've laid it by now. Going to wait for it to mature before we harvest it. Well, that's the time of the year they had the camp meetings, and they'd camp for 2 weeks at a camp meeting. Now, the whole point of a camp meeting was to make Christians out of sinners. We had 3 big camp meetings here in McMinn County. We had one at Cedar Springs. Some of you know where that is, at Spring Creek, and down at South Liberty. At these camp meetings, they had some unusual proceedings. Men sat on one side, women sat on the other side. But the most unusual thing they had, if they camped for 2 weeks, they might have services 3 times a day, but they never gave the benediction. And I used to ask my students, how do you know when to go home? How do you know when church is over? And finally one of them would say, okay, when the preacher gives the benediction. I'd say, right, that's a clue. And during the camp meetings, the services would go on, maybe 3 going on different times during the day, but never a benediction. Because this was frontier territory, and there were bad people in it, and there were bad men, and if they got drunk, they might get on horseback and ride through the camp meeting. And so the sheriff could come and arrest them for disturbing a worship service. You got it? Because the benediction hadn't been given. So at the end of 2 weeks, when the camp meeting is completely over, then they would give a benediction, and that would be it. Now, the camp meetings were very emotional, lots of singing, lots of shouting. Raise your hand if you've ever heard anyone get happy in church and shout. And I know I won't be the only one. My grandmother and Bill Fillers in Niota are probably the last 2 people who shouted in the Niota Methodist Church. But as a child, I can remember going there with my cousins, and we'd be sitting on a row watching Grandma, because we knew eventually she was going to get happy and shout. And it's a wonderful memory for me. It's never happened to me, but with her, it was so genuine that you knew that she was happy in the Lord and she was shouting. So there were lots of shouting and stuff like that at the camp meeting, very emotional. But they did a wonderful thing. They made Christians out of a lot of people, and those people came and joined the different churches on the frontier. They joined the Methodist, they joined the Baptist, they joined the Presbyterian. Any of you who have come from other denominations, Church of God, Church of Christ, Lutheran, whatever, your folks came later to Tennessee. The big 3 on the frontier were Methodist, Baptists, and Presbyterians. Okay, let's get back to all 3 of those churches being divided. Now, in the middle of this, it said, when the Methodist Church divided over the slavery issue in 1844, we became the Methodist Episcopal Church South. In 1851, a brick building built by slaves replaced our log building. So that's our second building downtown. We're still downtown. Miss Sarah and Penelope Ford took slaves from the farm, and they made the brick and built the first brick church down there. We do not have a picture of it. We do have a written description of it. They said it was built kind of up on a high hill. Now, when you go down there today, they've dug out so much dirt that you can't imagine that used to be a hill. But the little church was up on a hill, and then a lot of steps to get into it, and a lot of steps once you got into it. But it had a gallery for slaves. So if you check church history, you will find so many members recorded in a certain year and so many colored members where the slaves joined the church. Now, Mrs. Keith had one on the farm who would always drive her down for Sunday services. And he would take care of the horse and the carriage, and then he'd come in and take his place in the gallery. He was a man of such unusual perception that he would listen to the sermon so intensely that he could go back to the Keith farm that afternoon and preach that same sermon. Now remember, slaves could not read and write, so he couldn't take notes. I challenge you to do this. When Dave or Andrew are preaching, if I can remember what the scripture was, if I can remember the points of their sermon, that's what I'm trying to do. So if your mind ever wanders in church, think of somebody having to depend on you to tell what was done in church that day. So Sarah and Penelope Ford picked the right person to drive her downtown to the church. Now, we'll move on to the Civil War. Unfortunately, we got to get back to Parson Brownlow. Parson Brownlow, when the war is over, becomes governor of the state of Tennessee. And in that capacity, he's the worst governor we ever had. So you can just count him, bad, going all the way through. And you may say, well, how could a person that bad get elected governor of Tennessee following the Civil War? All you have to remember is who was not voting at that time. Ex-Confederates could not vote. So how do you think Parson Brownlow got himself elected? His own biographer said, if they had searched the whole state over to have found the worst possible man to have made governor of Tennessee, he'd been first choice. He was that bad. I told you he hated the Methodist, he hated the Baptist, he hated the Presbyterian, he hated the devil. Well, he added the Southern Methodist to that list too. He knew them best, and so he was very vindictive in spirit. After a war, especially a civil war, and you fought your own people, you need somebody to be kind, to try to bind up the wounds and all. That's not what we got. Now, I'm going to say one good thing about Parson Brownlow, and that'll be it. He wanted Tennessee back in the Union. He was always pro-Union. He's pro-slavery, which is hard to explain, but he was always pro-Union. And Tennessee was the last state to secede from the Union, and we were the first to rejoin. To rejoin the Union after the Civil War, you had to ratify the 13th and the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We had no problem ratifying the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves, but the 14th Amendment made them citizens with all the rights of citizenship. And so they did not want to ratify that one. So Parson Brownlow rounded up enough people from the Tennessee General Assembly and almost forced them to ratify the 14th Amendment. But it worked out to be very good for Tennessee. We returned to the Union first, so we were never under military occupation. The other southern states were all put under military occupation. And I don't care what history you're reading, everybody hates military occupation. And that will last for 12 years. So if you've wondered why an attitude in Tennessee is a little different than you'd find in South Georgia or lower part of Mississippi or something like that, that's the reason that we got back into the Union in time to escape that. And so that's the only good thing I can say about the parson. I didn't like the way he did it, but at least he got us back into the Union. Now, let's come on down your page. During the Civil War, the Southern Methodist Church was thrown out of their building downtown by the Northern Methodist Church. When you're on the winning side, that's what happens to you. So our little congregation that becomes Keith had to go down to the courthouse and worship for a number of years until we got the building back with a court case. Dr. Durwood Dunn, in his excellent research and the book that he wrote before he died about Methodism at the time of the Civil War and after, said that Emory and Henry College was educating ministers for the Southern Methodist churches. Parson Brownlow wanted a college to educate ministers for the Northern Methodist College, or Northern Methodist churches. So, you've won the Civil War. There's a college right here in Athens. You can either start a new college or you can take one away from somebody. And if you're on the winning side, you simply go to them and make them an offer they can't refuse. They offered them less than half of what the property was worth. And so the college moved from being a Southern Methodist college to a Northern Methodist college. And Parson Brownlow was right in the middle of all of that. So that is true. You can trust Dr. Durwood Dunn's research at any time. He was an excellent historian. Now, we're going to go back downtown. We've finally gotten our little brick church back from the Northern Methodist. And I don't know how many of you in the room are Methodists, but if you've ever driven into a town and there are two big Methodist churches almost looking at one another, and you think, oh, how did that happen? Well, Clinton, Tennessee, that Dwayne is from, has two Methodist churches on the same street. You could throw a rock from one to the other. And that's because one was Northern and one was Southern, and they had nothing to do with each other. Nothing at all. So that'll be your answer. Now, here in town, we were a Southern Methodist church. When the congregation that forms Trinity Methodist Church is formed, they're Northern Methodist. And we didn't have anything to do with them until the Methodist Church was put back together. I asked Miss Catherine Keith one day, I said, somebody from Trinity's called and they want some information about, our history. And she said, well, we had nothing to do with them, And I thought, Miss Catherine, good heavens, we have a common history for that. But anyway, that's the way it was. But we get the property back, and people being what people are, they started complaining about the little church building, that it was too hard to get into, too many steps and all like that. So they said, let's tear it down and let's build a third building on the same side. We've had a log building, we've had the first brick building, now we're going to build the second brick building downtown on one little lot. This is what our church looked like. I've always thought it looked a lot like Trinity. It was an absolutely beautiful building. It's set right there where that credit union is today. Lovely building, lovely stained glass windows. Mrs. Keith went in, Sarah and Penelope, who was always looking out after the church, took heart of pine timber off the farm and lined the whole interior of the church. I want you to keep that in mind because 75 years later, that church is going up in flames. So let that pine dry out for 75 years and see what happens then. But it was a lovely building that sat downstairs. Now, we've not mentioned a parsonage at all. Keith didn't have one in the beginning. We got a lot of unmarried Methodist ministers. They lived in the Keith mansion. In fact, if you'll get right in front of the Keith mansion and you'll look upstairs, the bedroom on the right was designated the preacher's room. And that's where they all lived, right with the Keith family, until one of them married one of her daughters. And things are going to change just a little bit. Now, one of those daughters is pictured here. She's up here on the back. And the Reverend D.W. Carter, who happened to be minister of our church when it was finished downtown, they married. This very tenderly raised Keith woman went with him down to Texas into that area, learned to speak Spanish, and then later on, when the Spanish-American War ended and Cuba is opened up for the missionary field, he will take that Keith woman with him to Cuba, and you can imagine what conditions would be like right after the Spanish-American War, and Bishop Candler of the Methodist Church will appoint him there as a missionary to Cuba. And it just stretches my mind to think of one of those Keith women who probably never did a day's hard physical work in her life, winding up on the mission field. But she did. Now, I failed to mention a couple right here on the top, so if you've got that out. Governor Frazier married one of her daughters, Louise Keith. And 10 years ago, descendants of the Fraziers called Keith Church and said, we're going to have a reunion. We're going to stay over at the mansion, and we want to come over to the church, and we want somebody to tell us a little something about the Keith family and Keith Church. Now, I don't know about you. I've been intimidated many times in my life, but never as intimidated as speaking to members of the Keith family about Keith family and Keith Church. But they were lovely people, and they spent the weekend and really enjoyed that. And one of the ladies was from Chattanooga. Now, let's move down to our beautiful brick building. Miss Sarah and Penelope Ford decided, after one of those preachers had married one of her daughters, to give us land for a parsonage. And so the Fore Farm ran all the way down here, down Madison Avenue, and she gave us land for a parsonage directly across from the museum here, where that strip mall is. That was our first parsonage. We've never known if she did it because she just wanted to donate it to them, or if she did it as a relief to herself for not having to house any more Methodist ministers there. But anyway, we'll move on to the turn of the century when Miss Keith will donate that land, and then move up to World War I, which will have an effect on our church, as it did on all churches at the time. We had great revivals back then. Reverend Sugar said one time they had such a large revival that only 2 TWC boys remained unconverted. And this added a lot of members to the church. In the 1920s, now we're still downtown, they added Sunday school rooms, they added a kitchen, a dining room, a pastor's study, and all like that while we're downtown. Then we hit the Depression years, and they're hard times for everybody, all churches of all denominations. They had trouble paying the preacher's salary during those years. But TVA came along and it brought new members to the church. When some of you have picked up one of the Keith history books here, there's a picture or two in there of the CAB men's Bible class. Sometimes 200 men would attend the CAB Bible class. That stands for Come and Bring Somebody With You, and they did. Now we're going to move up to 1939, a very historic year for the Methodist Church. It was decided that the church had been split apart for almost 100 years, and it was time to put it back together. So they brought together the Southern Methodist, the Northern Methodist, the Methodist Protestant, all of these branches of the Methodist Church, and they formed one big Methodist church. So we're all governed by the same conferences today. We were very thrilled with this. One problem was you could no longer call yourself Methodist Episcopal Church South. You had to have a name. We had a minister who knew the history of our church and knew what the Keith family had done over all the years. And he suggested that we should name the church Keith Memorial Methodist Church. The family was very reluctant to do that, but they insisted it has to be that way. And so in 1939, downtown, that beautiful church, we became Keith Memorial Methodist Church. Now, where am I on your sheet? Okay. We'll move up here to the top of the second page. In the early 1940s, the Young Adult Fellowship was formed and became in many ways a spark of congregational fellowship for many years. This was a very active group. World War II will come along. This Young Adult Fellowship will excavate the basement of the old church. One of them said, "I've dug more dirt for this church, than you could even imagine." The war years were hard on us. You had families who had people serving in World War II. And then we had a Sunday school class formed. 6 people went to Neil Ensminger, and lots of you remember Neil Ensminger, and said, "We want a new Sunday school class formed in the church, and we'd like to ask you to be our teacher." And Neil said, in good Methodist style, "I will teach until you can get somebody." So 50 years later, we celebrated Neil teaching the home service class of Keith Methodist Church, Keith Memorial Methodist Church. He was on the radio. He started out on WLAR, and it is broadcast today on Wixie. We'll move up to the Battle of Athens. We had a minister, the Reverend Bernie Hampton. Now, we've talked about the church downtown. Forey Hospital was directly across from our church, where the Athens Federal Capstar parking lot is today. Bernie Hampton visited everybody in the hospital, not just Methodists. Everybody got a visit from Bernie Hampton. So when the Battle of Athens comes along, everybody knows him and knows what kind of person he is. We had GIs coming back from World War II who said, "We've had election irregularities going on for a number of years. First, the Republican Party had the sheriff's job, and they did a lot of fee grabbing, where the sheriff could collect the fees, and that made the Democrats, of course, jealous. So 1946, the Democrats got the sheriff's job, and for the next 10 years, they did the same thing, lots of fee grabbing. They kept themselves in power by the poll tax that we had at that time that, thank heavens, we don't have anymore. But when the Battle of Athens culminated, and if you've not seen the video here at the museum, you need to see it. In 1946, August 1946, we had a night of violence. Nobody was killed. That's what you always need to remember from the Battle of Athens. Nobody was killed. Cars were overturned. A lot of things were done during that time. And Reverend Bernie Hampton from our church stepped forward and became one of the peacemakers. When they met the next day down in the courthouse, who do you think stood at the door and took up guns as the people came into the courthouse to decide how the government was going to be run until those that had been elected could be sworn into office? Bernie Hampton was elected one of the 3 people to govern this county until the newly elected people could be sworn in. In his obituary, his family put, he always considered that the high point of his ministry was acting as a peacemaker during and after the Battle of Athens. Now, I want to back up to what this Young Adult Fellowship was doing in the church downtown. They looked up at Tin Can Holler and places like that around Athens and said, there's a lot of need there. There are children that don't get anything at Christmas time. There are families that don't have enough food. And so they started Christmas parties inside the church. And they would buy up presents, and as people would come in, the children would come in, they'd take their names, and in the confusion of the party, they could put their name on a present so that when they were handed out, they had their name on it. Then afterwards, they would load up groceries and they would give to those needy families. Folks, that's the beginning of the Friendly Fella Club that you and I know today. They just put new carpet down. And you know women, how they are. the women were saying, oh, we put that new carpet down, now it's time for the Christmas party, and all those kids are going to come in here with their muddy feet. They said Judge R.A. Davis, that's Rob Davis's grandfather, stood up and said, are we a church or not? He said, as long as I have anything to say about it, and I do have something to say, we're going to have the Christmas party here in the church, and that's what they did. And this is what they had on Christmas Day back in 1947. Now, Ann, you remember, was your aunt there?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you with her?
Yes, I was.
Okay, at one of those last Christmas parties that were held in the church, there were 4 men that delivered baskets of food to the needy. There was Neil Ensminger, Frank Buttram, that's Hal's daddy. There was Harry Johnson Jr. and his father-in-law, Mr. Eddington. They went back to the old church. They said, we're going to lock up. Everybody in Athens has something to eat. We can go home to our own Christmas dinners. It was the last time the church was occupied. When Dr. Forey came to town the next morning, about 8 o'clock, he looked out and black smoke was coming out of the church. They called the fire department. Now, those of you who've picked up one of our free videos up here, if you'd like to see the church burning, fast forward one of those videos about 17 minutes into it. When we did the video history of Key Church about 20 years ago, Hal came up and said, did you know that Daddy took his movie camera down there and photographed it? And we had no idea. And so it's on the video of Keith Church. And by the way, anything up here on this table is free to any of you. It is free from Keith Church. But anyway, there we were with a church, and this is the old church as we call it. There are people in our church today who talk about that old church, and you can see tears well up in their eyes. They still have such wonderful memories of the old church. So we were faced with, let me look at the time. Why don't we just stop here at this point? The church is burned. That's a good place to stop. And everybody stand up and stretch for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll pick up with that. When the church burned down, we had a problem. Are we going to rebuild on the same lot downtown where there is no way to grow? Or are we going to relocate the church where it might be possible to expand? Well, as you can imagine, the Keith family came through. Marshall Keith said, why don't you come out here on the farm and look around and see if there's any place on the farm you'd like to build a church? So the committee went out and they looked at the site where the Athens Middle School is located today. They looked at the site where City Park School is located today. And then they said, no, this is too far out of town. So that's why we're not out on the Keith farm. Judge R.A. Davis owned a house and lot at the corner right over here across the street, and he offered that to the church and said, if you want this, we could build the church here. And so they took Judge Davis up on that. He had a house there, so we will build the sanctuary there, the transept, and just a few Sunday school rooms. They will renovate the house a little bit and use it until we can build an education building. But the problem was, how are we going to raise money? They had $13,000 worth of insurance. Now, we've got to build a whole new thing with $13,000 worth of insurance. The congregation had to meet somewhere when we didn't have a building. And so we met in Old McMinn County High School, and you're right here in part of it. Those of us that went to McMinn can remember the auditorium, those creaky floors. You remember that? An old piano up on the stage, bedraggled curtains and all. They came over here, and that's where they started meeting. And when they had to make a decision about rebuilding. But they said the most warm-hearted people in the world were there, and they grew in membership when they didn't even have a building. So that ought to tell you something about the spirit of the people. But guess who became the first chairman of the building committee? Marshall Keith himself. Within 6 weeks, he's dead. His widow came forward and said, if you still want to build out here on the farm, it'll be made available. But they'd already made up their decision, not going to do that. So the next person, Mr. Hornsby, that's Bob Foster's relative, became the chairman of the Board of Trustees and the building chairman. They started building on the sanctuary, and it wasn't long before he was dead. So they had to get a third chairman of the building committee, and they went to Judge R.A. Davis and asked him if he would be chairman of the building committee, and he was chairman when the sanctuary was completed. But shortly after that, he died. And his funeral was the first funeral ever held in the sanctuary of Keith Church, where it is today. Then we had a minister who knew that Fred Wankin had a great sense of humor. Now raise your hand if you remember Fred Wankin, and many of you can. The minister went to him and said, we've lost 3 chairmen of the building committee, and I have been sent to ask if you'll be next. So, anyway, Fred became chairman of the building committee, and Fred lived to be 95 years old and was the self-appointed photographer of Keith Church. Now, I just looked over here where Mark Cochran was seated. I'm going to have to digress because Mark said you failed to tell my favorite story on Parson Brownlow. So I meant to tell it when we started. So pardon me, I promised Mark I would tell you this. The portraits are painted of our Tennessee governors, and the 8 most recent governors always hang in the Capitol building. So of course Parson Brownlow's portrait was hanging there, and you remember the Southern Methodists hated him. The ex-Confederates hated him because they didn't have a vote. They would walk through our Capitol building in Nashville with their mouth full of tobacco juice and spit on his portrait. When they cleaned up that portrait, historians had a fit. They said, we've never had a governor whose portrait was spit on before. But they have cleaned it up, and that portrait today hangs in the Tennessee State Museum over in Nashville. So I promised Mark I would tell you his favorite story about Parson Brownlow. Now let's go back to our church. Sorry for the little blip there. I just forgot when I first started. Okay, I told you that Marshall Keith died, and his widow came forward with a new sanctuary and said, I want the chancel window in his memory. And so she immediately put that in. Miss Gertrude was always a Baptist. She never joined the Methodist church. But Marshall Keith was one of our great churchmen. Now, we've got a new sanctuary. We have a movie star who is from Athens, Peggy Varnado, who acted in Hollywood under the name of Peggy Dow, and you can Google her and find out. She made about 9 movies in Athens, but the family lived out on Ingleside Avenue, and her father taught Sunday school and was on the board of our church. She made movies. You may remember the comedy Harvey with Jimmy Stewart. That's one of her most famous movies. It's always on the 100 best list of comedies made in Hollywood. But anyway, she had met, when the family was living in Louisiana, Walter Helmerich. And after she had made 9 movies, they decided to marry. So she came back here, home to Athens, and was married in Keith Church. At that time, our altar rail, made out of those heavy spindles, went all the way across the front of the church. Her father came forward to the board and said, we'd like to saw that thing in 2 and make 2 pieces out of it, so that when she's married, she can go up the 3 steps to where the pulpit is and be married. Well, that sounded like a good idea. And so they did. They split the altar rail, and it's much easier to move today. since it is two pieces, but it's never been put back together because we like it so much. When there's communion, the ministers serve communion with that split altar rail. When there's a wedding, when there's a funeral, or anything else. So it was split for Peggy Dow's wedding, which was the largest wedding we ever had in Keith Church. Now, Mrs. Keith came forward again at this time and said, "Your parsonage is in bad shape." She said, "There's one stipulation: you have to build in 6 months." Now, we've just gone in debt to build the sanctuary. Now we're going in debt to build a parsonage. We need an education building. So we're going to tear down the old Davis house, and we're going to build the first education building. Now, Keith people are good at fundraising. They did everything in the world to try to pay for our indebtedness at this time. Tom Sherman came up and said, "I will build the outside walls of the first education building." Frank Buttram said, "I'll pay for the subflooring." So they laid that down. And then the Korean War was going on, and Buddy Liner was involved in it. He sent his allotment check home, told his mother, "Put this on the building fund." We had a preacher who was very good at fundraising, and he took 45 brand new $1 bills in one Sunday morning and said to the members, "Come up here and take $1 and use your talent and your interest to multiply it. And then we'll set a date and we'll bring that money back to the church." So they did everything imaginable. Edith Buttram cut people's hair because she was trained as a beautician. We've always had good cooks in Keith Church. They cooked everything. They made pot holders. They did everything imaginable to multiply those $45 and pay on the building fund. So that is one thing that we are good at trying to pay off a debt. So we have built the first education building. We don't have a Boy Scout troop. 1957 rolled around, and the Boy Scout troop number, let me get the 118, do we have any members of that troop here? Was created in Keith Church, and today it is the largest Boy Scout troop that we have. The women of the church decided to put out a cookbook, and this was before cookbooks were the in thing to do. The WSCS, the Women's Society of Christian Service, put out a cookbook, and we have published 7 editions of that cookbook. The women said they kind of thought the letters WSCS stood for "We Serve Church Suppers" instead of the Women's Society of Christian Service. And then in 1958, we started a live nativity scene at Christmas time, and the Armstrongs started bringing animals to that, and the children especially look forward to petting those animals around the nativity scene. In 1958, we started sponsoring foreign missionaries, Robert Lundy to Malaya and Gene Matthews to Korea. Now our church finances 3 missionaries. One from Alaska was just there this past Sunday. One up in Virginia and one in Liberia. Short mission trips were taken. And then in 1962, we built the second education building. We call it the Activity Center, which is a fancy name for gym. And this was a leap of faith to build 4 buildings in 15 years, a parsonage, a sanctuary, and 2 education buildings. In 1966, schools in McMinn County were integrated. And where do you think the leaders of the black community, Professor Nash, Chuck Redfern, I think was mayor at that time, Neil Ensminger, of course, and others met to discuss exactly how integration was going to take place in our community. They met in what today is the men's Sunday school room of our church, and they planned everything about integration, and it worked just fine here. Now, 1968 is a big year for the Methodist Church. We merged with the United Brethren Church, and so our name will be changed to Keith Memorial United Methodist Church. An altar guild was formed, sanctuary, flowers. Clarice Mayfield is sitting back there, Clarice Mayfield Baggett. Goldie Mayfield, for 7 years, had planted flowers in her garden so that she could fix flowers for the church. So for 7 years, we had 2 matching bouquets from Miss Mayfield in the sanctuary. And the family would say she'd get so excited she found a flower that would bloom at a different time so she could put it in our bouquets. We had an acolyte service that began in 1970 and children's sermons in the church. 71 is when Miss Catherine gave us the 6 windows down the side of the sanctuary. And in 1973, with our new change to merging with the Brethren Church, all of the women's circles had to choose a name. And I always loved it that a young women's circle decided to name themselves the Catherine Keith Circle. And Miss Catherine was very pleased with that, and that circle still is active today. In 1973, we had Chrismon trees in our church. Christ monograms. Each ornament on the tree is a religious symbol, and it's a lovely tradition at Christmas time. In 1976, we had an extensive remodeling of the sanctuary. As one woman in our church said, you know what, about every 30 years out here at Keith, somebody wants to do something. And what they wanted to do was to lighten up the sanctuary, which they did with new pews, and they put wainscoting over the brick that was on the side walls and made it a lot lighter. But we had a new organ, and a Mother's Day Out program started, and now we call it Parents' Day Out. In 1979, we started a TWC scholarship program. $5,000 was put aside every year for anyone from Keith Church who attended Tennessee Wesleyan. They could apply for $1,000. Will you think of $5,000 being given to Wesleyan every year for years and years? I called up there a few years ago, and they said the amount is now that we have given is over $200,000 that Keith has given to the scholarship funds, and lots of people have benefited from that. In 1980, we added a second Sunday morning service, and there are some of us here in the room who faithfully attend that morning service. We bought a van that year, and while Dan Kelly was minister at our church, we added a second minister. The first time we'd had an associate minister appointed by the conference. His name was Steve Blakemore. He's very interesting because Steve, along with 2 other young Methodist ministers, formed Resurrection, which is the largest gathering of youth in East Tennessee. They meet in January up in Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge area. It is so large now they have to meet on 2 different weekends. But that was started by a young minister while he was in our church. Now, in 1986, Miss Catherine Keith died, and in her will, she left a large sum of money to the church. I told you the Keiths have always taken care of Keith Church. They divided that amount, and they put part of it into a maintenance trust to maintain the building, and nothing would have pleased Miss Catherine more than that. And the other went into an unrestricted trust that is used for different things, never for budgetary items, but for different things the church need to do. In 1986, we started something at Keith Church. We intended to call it The Gathering, but knowing Keith people, very soon it became a nickname, Donut Church. We have it between the Sunday morning service and Sunday school, where people meet over in the gym or the activity area, and it's a time of fellowship. And now they just put it in the bulletin or put it in a calendar as Donut Church. Then in 1986, Mayfield Dairy gave us the parking lot. Many of you probably parked there today. The parking area between the museum and Keith Church, which we share. Now, get my notes. Okay, 1986, we remodeled the first education building, and there were short-term mission trips while Dan Kelly was at our church. Then in 1987, something started that was free in Keith Church. They looked around at Thanksgiving and they said people are alone at Thanksgiving time and don't have anyone to eat with them. So we're going to have a free meal at Keith Church and invite anyone who wants to come and participate in that. That has grown over the years to now we have carry out, where people call and get on a list, tell their address, and meals are taken to families at Thanksgiving time. Last year, they served over 600 meals, free meals from Keith Church. We have more food that goes out of our church than any church around. Now, we opened a library, we bought buses. In 1991-92, we started the Child Development Center, which is called Keith Children's Academy today. Now, in 1992, we decided to renovate the sanctuary, not a complete renovation, but to make more space for the choir and to enclose the areas between the buildings. So after this renovation, you could walk from the sanctuary over to the activity center without having to go outside, that you could stay inside. In 1992, we had a brand new Sunday school class formed called the Corner Class. I don't know what you know about it, but it is for developmentally delayed adults. They're very much a part of our church. We found out that no one was doing anything for them at the Tri-County Center at Christmas time. And so Jim Dodson said, we've got to do something about this. And so we started bringing those developmentally delayed adults to our church for a Christmas party at Christmas time. And Jim and others would go out to the Tri-County Center, interview each one of them, find out what they wanted for Christmas, and that's what they got. People would pay for those gifts for them. If ever you get at Christmas time and you don't have the Christmas spirit, you come out to Keith Church and attend that Christmas party. There is more joy in that room. You cannot leave there without having some Christmas spirit. Nobody complains, and everybody is not only tickled with what they get, but what others on each side of them got. Everybody's excited about it. You can participate in that at our church. We also send developmentally delayed adults to Camp Lookout, and that will be coming up in July or August of this year. The church has always made sure that if anyone could not afford it in that group, that scholarships would be provided. And that's what we do each year. Now, we'll get up to Keith celebrating its own birthday. In 1999, we were celebrating the fact we were 175 years old. And those of you that picked up a copy of that video, that's when we made the video history of Keith Church. And you'll find a lot of people on that video that you're familiar with in Athens, Neil Linsminger and lots of people on that. If you want to watch the church burn, fast forward 17 minutes into it and you can watch the church burn on that. But we enjoyed interviewing 66 people to tell what they had done at Keith Church. Now we get up to 2001, and for 4 years, when all of the things were added up, all the money was added up, at the end of the year, we wound up with extra money that had not been budgeted. Rather than carry that money over into the next year, they found ways to give it away. We would give it to Camp Lookout. We would give it to organizations here in town. And so that was a joy for the church, so that we could start out even each year with the budget. Now, we have a ministry called the Stephen Ministry in our church. Move up to 2004, contemporary worship service began. And it started in the activity room, the gym of the church, and very quickly outgrew it. And so a leap of faith for Keith Church, they decided that we'd always just had small building added on to the church when we needed it, but we would get involved in the first big building program we had in 40 years. You know, about every 30 or 40 years we want to do something over there. So we got involved in a $3 million multi-use building. We have the contemporary service, the gathering, that you can seat about 390 in that place. There were new office suites, a new children's edition. However, a recession started 1 year later. And here's Keith involved in a tremendous building program, and we're right in the middle of the worst recession we've had in years and years. And so we'll have to pay off that building during the recession, and 5 years later, that building will be debt-free. And we're thankful for that. I moved into the building in 2009. Now, in 2010, the Grace and Mercy mission began. It did not start in Keith Church. It is supported by members of Keith Church, and we cook and serve there. In 2012, we started a brand new program. Dixie Liner was tutoring a child here in Athens, and the child said, "I'm hungry." Jesus said to feed the hungry. Dixie came back to our church and said, "We have kids that can't learn because they're hungry. They have not eaten enough." And so the church began the program called Nourish One Child. And last year, at the end of the school year, we were furnishing bags that the children take home. And we were furnishing 270. We're getting close to 300 bags that go out of our church each week. And there's a lot of people that work in that. And it's not just Keith Church people. Anyone who wants to volunteer to pack those bags and get them ready for the children, just call the church and say, "I'm available at a certain time." They're packed during the week and taken to the schools on Friday. The kids put them in a backpack and they have something to eat on the weekend. Now, let's see if I've got anything else. That brings us kind of down to the end of it. On your booklet where it says Jesus said to feed the hungry, and our Thanksgiving meal and our Nourish One Child. Other McMinn County churches have copied our outreach program to children. Keith Church is not a building. The church is the people. Keith is a caring church where members use their talents and interests to make the world a better place. We believe that Christians are interdependent and must help bear others' burdens. And so the members at Keith Church will reach out to serve. When you join Keith Church, you are asked this: do you promise to support the church with your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness? And Dr. Durwood Dunn said, one of the things I like best about being a Methodist is Methodists don't run around talking about their faith a lot. They're too busy practicing it. And I thank you very much, each one of you, for being here. I love Keith Church. I love local history. And I hope you've learned something this morning. Thank you so much.